Good morning, everyone. This is Michele Hughes from Ageless and Timeless. My guest today is actually a Brit. He's from England, and his name is Rob Verkerk, and he has been in the health and wellness space for, well, since at least 2002 in an active role as the executive director, I guess. Is that your title, Rob?
That is right, Michele.
Yeah, of the Alliance for Natural Health International, correct?
Yeah, and USA as well.
Right.
ANH USA as well.
Well,
Yeah.
that's why I said international, because you added the USA. You had someone here for about 15 years, and then
Right.
you took over the responsibility for. So you have a really busy life.
I do. And we have another office in Amsterdam as well. So
Oh my
yeah, we
goodness.
have yeah,
So where are you today doing this podcast?
today I'm doing the podcast from the UK. I'm actually a Dutch national, so I'm not I sound like but
Oh,
I'm a Dutch national, and next week I'll be back in the States. So
okay.
I literally I moved backwards. It will
I do remember you telling me that, and you'd have a Dutch last name anyway. So,
yeah.
but you have a British accent. That's strange.
I do, yeah. I was a victim of the British boarding school system when my parents were living the other side of the world.
Right, and you went to school at Imperial College, right? You
No, I
graduated
I did my university, yeah. I did my master's and PhD and postdoc all at Imperial. Yeah.
college. How would you compare Imperial College to what university in the U.S. would it
It's
be comparable to?
Imperial, Oxford, and Cambridge are really the three top universities in the UK, so they're equivalent to Yale, Harvard, Berkeley,
Yeah, okay.
etc. Yeah.
I went to Oxford. I'm proud to say I had my little stint in on the Thames, and I learned how to punt.
Oh, well
But
done. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it was a graduate program from where I went to undergraduate in the University of Massachusetts in Amherst,
Okay.
Massachusetts. I don't know if you know that, but it's a
I know,
very,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, very progressive school. And they had a program for graduate students to go over to England and to Oxford. I mean, so I was at St. Hilda's College.
Okay.
And so we spent like a summer, it was about 3.5 months. It was really funny because when I went over there, I was as skinny as a rail. And I mean, like people, when I came back to pick me up at the end, they couldn't recognize me because we had been eating the food was so bad at those days in St.
Oh,
Hilda's. So we went on the high, on the main street, and we would go to all the pastry shops and eat all the carbs. So we were certainly not your poster children for healthy eating at that time. But it was because England didn't have, or Oxford didn't have, the really good quality food. I know that's changed now, and certainly in London.
It's changed a lot. And of course, the other thing is your microbiome wouldn't have been adjusted to, moving from a US diet to a European or a UK diet. It wouldn't be adjusted. So that's
That is so true. And not only that, but I was there in the summer, but I got the worst um, nasal or sinus infection and cold that I'd ever had in my entire life. I'd never been so sick where I actually had to take antibiotics, which I refused, in my adult life have refused to do unless it's a real crisis. Well, that was a real crisis. So I think the weather, even though it was warmer, it was still damp. And, coming out of New England, even with the humidity, I just wasn't used to it. So that was an adjustment to the health and wellness
you
of.
were not epigenetically adapted to the United Kingdom, and
There
you
you go.
suffered as a result, Michele.
That
Yeah, that's and it's the same. People going the other way. We're as we become more and more global citizens, you could argue that we've seen over the last 50 years or so, food's becoming more and more similar, but
Yeah,
still there are pretty big
adjust
differences. Yeah,
adjustments.
yeah.
So, Rob, start us off by telling us more about you. Everybody always wants to know who is your guest, Michele, and why did you choose him or her to come on your show? So, give us some thumbnails of your background. What influenced you to become who you are today?
Well, I've had a lifelong interest in really getting under the covers of understanding what nature is and why it is, even to the point of really trying to understand what life is. I was giving a talk, it was a couple of years ago in a huge mansion in the UK. There were two of us who were key speakers, and I had a load of top doctors and scientists in the audience. And I was sitting between two oak trees. I'd taken everyone out of the lecture theatre. It was a
Mm,
beautiful summer's afternoon, unlike the weather that you had when you were in Oxford.
mm,
And
right.
and I said, look, let's start by talking about life. What is life? And I was astounded that amongst these doctors and scientists, people were very unsure of what life is.
Mm,
That when someone dies,
mm,
chemistry, exactly the same chemistry, is still there. But
mm,
what happens is that electrical and bioelectrical and electromagnetic impulses, including from the heart and the brain, stop. But bottom line is we haven't got a clear view of it. So I was a kind of kid growing up in Africa that was fascinated by the jungle and by the bugs, and um, I was being pushed during my schooling years towards economics. And I thank God my grandmother in Holland said, "Why are you doing economics?" She swayed me back and I became an ecologist.
mm,
So I carried on studying nature. I then became very concerned about the way corporations were interfering with our environment and with our choices. And
mm,
I then spent 10 years or so campaigning in Australia on getting chemicals out of foods and agriculture and for termite control, you name it. That was my goal for 10 years. I then went back into academia, went back to Imperial College, did a master's and a PhD, and then 7 years of postdoc in the field of sustainable agriculture, but looking particularly at food quality and how to produce the healthiest foods with the highest nutrient values that didn't become inundated with disease and insects and all the rest of it. And the
mm,
more I did that work, the more I realized that the chemistries that were required in a plant to avoid being ravaged by pest and disease were the same chemistries that were beneficial to humans when we eat small quantities of them. And
mm,
because at Imperial College we had a big, biology and ecology department, but also a big medicine department. Whenever I would talk to the medics, I was always amazed that they had no interest or no understanding when I'd say, "Hey, look, we're studying these really interesting glucosinolates, for example, in cruciferous vegetables, and we find in the cruciferous vegetables that have high levels, there's no need to use pesticides. These things act as natural pesticides. But
mm,
look, I've been reading papers that say that when you consume small amounts of these compounds, they're really protective against cancer." And I
mm,
remember specifically asking one of the top oncologists at Imperial this question about glucosinolates, and he looked at me as if I had two heads and said, "I
mm,
don't know what you're talking about. We do chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and surgery." And round about 2002, I was offered permanent tenure at Imperial College. And so I had to make a decision as to whether to become an academic for the rest of my life, build my research group, or go back to my campaigning roots. And by this stage, I was really concerned about how nature was being completely stripped apart. And, I wanted to create a linkage between those of us who produce the healthiest foods on the planet and those who produce the healthiest humans. In other words,
mm,
the integrative medicine community.
mm,
And that's really what I've been building for the last 20 odd years. And funnily enough, I'm going to Ohio next week for a big 35 strong expert panel think tank to do exactly that, to bring the regen ag leaders together with the integrative medicine leaders so that we can build strategy that links to
But
market.
you were way ahead of your time. I mean, honestly, this hasn't really, even today, you don't see, I mean, I'm glad you're going to Ohio for 35 people, but 35 people is a microcosm. There's
It's
still
it's it,
so
it
much lack of
yeah,
knowledge.
it's a think tank. So these are the leaders in many
Yes.
of the leaders in the field so that we can really, it's a closed door think tank, invitations only.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Gematria Products. Gematria is based in Carlsbad, California, and they manufacture ultra high quality dietary supplements using QI technology. Qi, as you probably know, is the energy that runs throughout our bodies and is the basis of Chinese medicine. Use the code AGELESS and get 20% off your order. I highly recommend Gemetria's products. I personally use the Complete Aminos, the Heart Gems, and the Methuselah Life, which is an RNA and DNA sublingual spray. The website to go to is www.gematria.com/QI-technology. And there you'll find out more about this fascinating company, their products, and the technology.
Mhm.
Meeting. But you know, we were in the 1980s, we were fighting against glyphosate. You know, and I
Mhm.
look at people, the fact that we still have to try and fight, the fact that we, you know, back in 1991, I wrote one of the first papers that was um, showing deep scientific concern for GMOs and the outdoor release of GMOs. In our
Mhm.
field site in the UK, actually, the first outdoor trial of GMOs using oilseed rape was conducted. And
Mhm.
two of us, a visiting US professor and myself, penned a paper in a fairly minor journal because we had to put it in a minor journal. Major journals wouldn't have accepted it, but called Biocontrol News. And we said, guys, this idea of having a 250-meter boundary zone between a GM crop and a non-GM crop, thinking you can keep it clear, is
Right.
complete madness
Correct.
because we know what gets caught up in the jet streams that moves across
Correct.
continents. We've been studying this with aphids and
Correct.
toxins and other things. So this was lunacy. But right now, in fact, the Trump administration is trying to deregulate GMOs. They're trying to do the same.
Ah.
They're going exactly in the wrong direction.
Oh my gosh, that's shocking with Elon. I mean, with Robert F. Kennedy.
Yeah, so you got Kennedy, who's got a view that's pretty closely aligned. You know, we were in the U.S. Senate in January pushing to get Bobby Kennedy in. We
Yeah.
our legal counsel, Jonathan Emord, and myself, wrote a book called. In fact, we can call that out. But the Maha Mandate, reversing
Uh-huh.
America's
Oh.
chronic disease epidemic. So we
Oh.
wrote a book and distributed it to every single senator. Bobby
Uh-huh.
gets in, but you will know that his hands are largely tied, and you've got many opposing forces. Donald Trump wants to do stuff that's good for business, and sometimes it doesn't matter which kind of business. So
Uh-huh.
agrochemical businesses, pharmaceutical businesses are, you know, which we would argue are two very, very concerning businesses that are being.
I'm very shocked about that because it seemed like the drug industry and then of course the food industry were targets right at the very beginning in January when they had that meeting with RFK and the top people from the even Monsanto and Bayer and Abbott and all the the big guys
Yeah,
and the General Mills, General Foods, Procter and Gamble. They were all there,
yeah,
and they were being challenged, but apparently that hasn't held weight
well,
for going forward with respect to what you're just talking about.
yeah. You know that there's progress in some directions, and there's progress in opposite directions. You know, perhaps you can use as an analogy one of the reasons for the breakdown in the relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk is
Yes.
because of the savings that Elon Musk worked hard to create through Doge.
Yes.
It's immediately undone by the big beautiful bill and the
Yeah.
golden dome. So this is quite typical of the characteristics of this administration, where you've got some stuff that is really moving in the right direction and a
Right.
bunch of other stuff going in the opposite direction. So
Well, so
it's not coherent.
are you saying that the U.S. is going to be the leader waving the flag for whatever happens in the future for with respect to the work that you're doing?
Well, yeah, look, the opportunity is huge. I mean, having Bobby Kennedy heading up HHS is a massive opportunity. We are actually developing 28 initiatives. Eight of them we've already unleashed this year that are going to be creating a sea change to regulation around food, drugs, dietary supplements, health products generally.
Mhm.
So we are, pushing very, very hard to use constitutional grounds, case law. There was a phenomenal change in underlying case law when the Chevron doctrine that was passed in 1984, that really was the vehicle that US agencies, government agencies, were using to overreach, whether it's the FDA, the FTC, the EPA. They were able to use any point of legal ambiguity and go, do you know what? We will make the determination. So that's how they overreach. That's how they go beyond the law. And that was overturned on the 28th of June last year. And that's one of the reasons that Jonathan has joined us. Jonathan Emord, also known as the FDA Dragon Slayer, because he's won more cases against the FDA than any other attorney, 14 and counting. And
Mm.
he joined our team. He said, Rob, we've worked together for 20 years. He's six of his 14 wins have been on behalf of our organization, Alliance for
Mhm.
Natural Health. And but now he's in-house, and we're, in the space of a year, we got 28 initiatives that we're using to really bust open the market, the ability to communicate scientific truth. The amount of censorship that is built up
No,
over over the decades is I mean, this control, this monopolization that the drug companies have had, even over nutrients, and disease claims. So one of our actions is using a particular clause in the FDA Modernization Act that Jonathan wrote many years ago,
mhm.
that basically says if a health agency, a health authority, makes an authoritative claim around a nutrient disease relationship. So, one of the ones that people know a lot about that's now authorized is the use of folate or folic acid to
Yeah,
reduce the risk of neural tube defects.
yeah.
But if we're going to be looking at the ability of curcuminoids, for
Mhm.
example, some of these compounds in turmeric to
Mhm.
reduce cancer risk. There's a huge amount of data on that. The drug companies are busy working on it.
Mhm.
But what happens is that government authorities like the Office of Dietary Supplements within the NIH
Mhm.
on their website actually say that. But if you're a commercial customer, you want to sell a dietary supplement containing that product, you can't put the claim on you can only put a structure function claim on your label. Now, we've got a list of about 150 key claims, nutrient disease claims, that health authorities, primarily the NIH, are making about nutrients and diseases. And basically, using this clause in the FDA Modernization Act, we're petitioning the FDA to say, guys, we want all of those to be able to be used in public speech, including commercial speech. Now,
Mhm.
that will, for the first time, take away this control by
Mhm.
the drug companies to control speech. So they are the only ones who can talk about drugs in relation to disease. We want to be able to talk about nutrients or food in
Mhm.
relation to disease. If we can't do that, we cannot make America healthy again.
It seems like countries like Switzerland, as an example, and Austria, they're so far ahead in terms of their belief in natural functional integrative medicine, and yet they don't ever get used as the examples for countries like the US or Great Britain as role models to follow some of their precepts. So why is that?
Basically, because the essentially the drug companies and the food companies and the agrochemical companies use two major bases in the industrialized world. One is Europe, the EU, and you've got
Yeah.
to remember up until Brexit, the UK was one of the key drafters of EU legislation. Most of the legislation around drugs, agrochemicals, GMOs has been created by the Brits. So now that you've got Brexit, it really is one and the same thing. So you
Mhm.
got that as one major area, and then the US as the other. And essentially, what's happened over the last 80 or so years is that we've developed a corporatocracy. This is where essentially very large corporations integrate into the functioning of government and
Mhm.
are no longer separate entities, and they work in their joint interest. The government wants to control, and corporations want power and control. And that's one of the reasons we've seen extreme censorship. It's one of the reasons we've seen, the licensing system for drugs develop as a pay-to-play system. You pay
Mhm.
your money, and then you're allowed to call your product safe and effective, even if the scientific data says otherwise, that it's not safe.
Mhm.
We know that drugs can be the third leading cause of death in Western
Mhm.
societies, from Peter Gotcher and others. And if it's ineffective, and we know from multiple publications, BMJ Clinical Evidence, before it was closed down, had evaluated 3,000 mainstream interventions and found that only 10% of them had been scientifically found to be beneficial. So
And why would they close down? I think I know the
Why,
answer.
yeah,
It's a
but
rhetorical.
because we were exactly very good rhetorical question, Michelle.
Mhm.
It's because all of us were using that as evidence for for the fact that the drug regulatory system does not work. And
Mhm.
but we're in the middle of major academic studies. We've submitted a major paper that looks at drug and food definitions in 18 different jurisdictions in the world over a 120-year period. And that's in peer review at the moment. And what it shows incredibly clearly when you take a bird's eye view of what's happened over the last 120 years is that originally food and drug law was out there to protect us, the
Mhm.
citizen, the consumer. Over this last 120 years, it shifted. Now it protects the corporations,
Mhm.
and we've got a situation where food is killing us and drugs are killing us. The two
That,
things,
that that
I mean, it's
you know,
crazy.
Rob, that is such a sobering statement. But it's so true. I mean, the Industrial Revolution changed everything in terms of the priorities and the concern for the health of the individual versus the health and or the bottom line of the corporate entity. So, and when we say corporate, we're talking about, not just the corporations, but the medical establishment and the government entities that are controlled. So, I mean, it is like a three-pronged monster, at least three. Would there be any country that you would use as a role model for what you're trying to achieve with your alliance?
There isn't really a country that has got it all right. I mean, it's really interesting when you look at small, generally you have to look to small countries where they have many things more right. Places like Costa Rica are developing some pretty interesting regulatory systems because they really understand the power of nature. I mean, one of the reasons that we don't see it in any significant, large country is that the industrial complex, whether it's the censorship industrial complex, the agricultural industrial, medical industrial complex, these complexes have become so dominant that they use regulation as a mechanism to essentially further their own ends.
Yeah.
So, we saw it during COVID when, a few countries, Zambia, Tanzania, decided to reject the receipt of COVID vaccines, and immediately they faced penalties. I mean, this is the way in which
they were punished.
yeah, they were punished. So the incentive to be able to stand out there and go against the flow is questionable. And this is I think one of the reasons that there was so much excitement around the arrival of Donald Trump. The reasons he got in, because people thought he's not from that system.
Right.
Let's see what he can do. And so hopefully that there is, COVID in many respects has backfired on the system. They wanted to use it as a process to catalyze more control. What it's done instead is it's woken a whole bunch of people up who were asleep, on the tiller. So
and particularly, I don't need, we don't need to get into the vaccine part, but it would be irresponsible not to mention that the vaccine has really caused an awakening, because it was done within such a speedy time to, basically it was done with good intention, but there has never been a vaccine that's developed and produced and used so quickly in history. So, it usually goes the other way. It's like a 10-year period, but this was in 9 months. So
yeah, and of course it has been misclassified. We are considering a legal action on its classification, because it's really not a vaccine at all. I mean, it's only a vaccine because they have modified the definition of a vaccine. So a vaccine is any substance that modifies the the immune response, and basically, generally speaking, it's only a very small part of the immune response. Typically, it's an antibody response. You can equally argue that there are a whole range of natural substances that also fulfill the definition of a vaccine. Whereas the average person's interpretation of a vaccine, the only way in which you can argue that everyone should be vaccinated is if a vaccine actually reduces transmission. And
that was
established. Yeah, it was established very early on. This one doesn't. So it's basically a medical treatment, and it is also a gene therapy product. So and of course what they've done, I mean, what they've done in the UK in the recent amendment to the medicines regulations, they've passed a law to make it illegal to call it a gene therapy product, because everyone's calling it a gene therapy product. So this is the way in which legislation is used to control the space. So,
Rob, you've had a lot of resistance, just, obviously because of what you're doing. You're going against the, industrial complex. But I noticed on Wikipedia, which I always thought was pretty reliable, but yet they even said there something that was kind of pejorative about your work, like, oh, he went against science, and so how do you deal with those kinds of challenges in your professional life, which
you wear it as a badge of honor? In essence, I mean, honestly, in everything that we do, we call what we do good science and good law. I have been astonished over the last 5 years, particularly since COVID, but it was happening. It was part of a creep that was going on well before that. The deterioration in the quality of science is staggering. I read things in major journals like, BMJ probably less so. It is now one of the best medical journals, I feel. But the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, that is astonishing. The abstract does not reflect accurately the results. The methodology is not clear enough for someone to be able to duplicate the experiment, because they leave a whole bunch of data out. The statistical significance is interpreted as being equivalent to biological significance, when actually they're only finding statistical significance because they're looking at a randomized controlled trial in which the internal validation standards are so tight, there's so little other sources of variation. They just get a statistically significant result, but they make the assumption that if you take that same intervention into the real world, you'll get the same result. And this is the difference between efficacy, which you measure under experimental conditions in a randomized controlled trial, and effectiveness. So I've been a critic of that system. I've exposed a lot of it. And the only tactic that they use, all of us who have stood up and been dissenters of the mainstream scientific process, are all accused of engaging in pseudoscience.
Pseudoscience, that's what they said about you.
And once you then enter the realms, we have a big interest in biophysics and as applied to healthcare. So if you look at, say, the development of frequency devices in healthcare, this is one of the big emerging areas of medicine. But of course, it's very threatening to drug companies. It's very threatening to some of the mainstream medical device companies, and it's pushed into, it's marginalized essentially. So as soon as you deal with those more fringe areas that should be encouraged, because that is, as Einstein said, the next frontier of medicine will be frequency. We are frequency beings, and as if biochemistry and molecular biology and genetics was the end game. Of course, it's not the end game. It's part of a much bigger picture, and we're early in our journey in understanding even how humans function. And we are ultimately, we got to be very, very open. So to be a good scientist, to be even a skeptic scientist, you have to have an incredibly open mind. And one of the big disturbing changes in the scientific mainstream is that so many of these scientists have become incredibly narrow-minded. That's not good for science.
Well, not only that, but these studies are often funded by the very people that are intended to gain by the results. So how can we say that it's true science if it's not objective?
Because the part of being narrow-minded is to make sure that you do things that please your sponsor, your funder, and essentially the whole scientific system is controlled by money now.
Exactly.
Nature doesn't do that. We've always, in my academic work, we would always use really complex ecosystems as our learning ground. So if we look at jungles, rainforests, and coral reefs, these are the most complex systems we know about. And the interchange of energy, the exchange, I mean, there's still a bunch of organisms eating one another, but out of all of that is a degree of coordination and feedback that yields something that is stable, sustainable, beautiful, and we as humans, we go in with a very limited understanding of this. And right now we are, I believe, at a bifurcation point in human evolution, because we're now beginning to meddle with our own genome, where we seem to be happy doing that. We are happy to turn the human body into a pharmaceutical factory, which is what happens when you use technologies like mRNA. You're getting the body to produce whatever medicine you want it to do. mRNA is seen as a very, very expansive platform for the pharmaceutical industry, which is why they want nothing to be said negative about it, which is why there's a big cover up on the number of people that have been adversely affected by COVID jabs.
So do you? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No. So we're at this point where we should be having a public debate over, are we going to accept a kind of transhuman future in which we blur the the interface between natural biology, if you can call it natural biology, and synthetic biology and technology, and that's beginning to happen. Censorship prevented any public discussion, and now you can see they're trying to deregulate CRISPR technology, gene editing, what I call GMO version 2. And the average person thinks, well, governments wouldn't allow something that was dangerous. It must all be tested. We keep hearing people saying that it's safe, just like COVID vaccines were safe.
Mhm.
But there's been no public discussion.
And then what about the future with technology? With the the very things that you just mentioned, but then adding in biotech and AI and where we're heading is that are they selling their soul? Those companies. It looks like biotech is already in the hands of the drug companies, so they're owned by drug companies.
Yeah,
So
the
that
drug
looks like
companies
it's
are,
already a dead
yeah.
issue. But what about AI?
Well, drug companies are certainly buying up many small biotech companies. They
Right.
use the small innovative biotech companies as their R&D. No, they don't want to spend money internally. Big drug companies don't spend money anymore on the same amount of money or the same investment in R&D as they used to. They just go and snap up other biotech firms and then merge their operations into
And
their
yet they
own.
justify their prices by the fact that their R&D costs are so high. So yeah, they're
Exactly.
saying R&D costs, that means the acquisition of these little biotech companies, not the R&D that they would have done
Exactly.
historically, where
Exactly. So
the costs.
AI, to come back to the second part of your question, AI is absolutely here to stay. I personally have no problem with AI when it's used externally, when it's used as an intelligent system in the same way that we use a computer as an intelligent system. It is incredibly helpful to process vast amounts of data that allow us to get information much
Yeah,
quicker
yeah.
and to be able to analyze and interpret data, which is what science is all about. So, an
Right.
incredibly valuable tool. However, in the wrong hands or in the wrong places,
Mm-hmm.
let's look at, say, the use of AI to create a downloadable synthetic memory, which
Mm-hmm.
is one of the ways in which it's being contemplated, it's being used. Now, that for me is where it's crossed the line. It's crossed the
Mm-hmm.
line because that really fits perfectly well with Klaus Schwab's view as put forward in his 2017 book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
where he looks at 23 different technologies. Um, you know, if you use AI to create designer babies, for example,
Mm-hmm.
I would have a problem with that because
Mm-hmm.
you no longer allow this extraordinary process that nature uses to decide what's good and bad. I mean, nature exchanges genetic material all the time. It decides through natural selection processes and evolution what should stay, what should change, what should adapt, what should become more resilient, less resilient. But once you start using essentially machine learning and AI to do that, you're susceptible to programs that are produced by people who have specific goals in mind.
Goals in mind.
And,
Yeah,
and
and one of those is control.
yeah, one of those is absolute control.
Yeah.
So, uh, yeah, I think we have to watch AI like a hawk. I think I think to be anti-AI makes no sense either.
Exactly. Yeah, but
But we have to use it cautiously.
the point though is that if you look at AI, it's if you want to take it to a spiritual level, the decision between good and evil,
Yeah.
and humanity has demonstrated they have a tough enough time choosing between good and evil in their everyday practices. So now we're adding another layer, a technological layer that is also forcing us to pick between good and evil because there's plenty of evil that AI can create,
Yeah.
but there's also plenty of good, as you just said. So I think it's
I find it really interesting to pose questions to AI models or machine learning models. Many of them are not true AI, they're more machine learning. But if you pose questions across different platforms, so you ask Grok versus Google Gemini versus ChatGPT, for example,
Mhm.
you'd be amazed at the differences in results. And you can see that Google, in my mind, provides the most standard status quo type response consistently.
Mm,
And if you look at Google, one of the largest um, tech platforms in the world,
mm-hmm,
many of the people involved with it are big on control, big
mm-hmm,
on control of information. Google's and YouTube's medical misinformation policy is absolute madness. Basically they say, unless you're saying what the government say, what the FDA, the NIH say, they've taken off very recently, they've taken off the World Health Organization off their medical misinformation policy, which is interesting.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
That's
we just saw it a couple of weeks ago when we checked, because we've been campaigning against Google because of that policy. Basically, they said if a information around medicine, whether it's disease treatment or prevention, if it does not comply with the views and perspectives of local national health authorities or the WHO, it's
mm-hmm.
disallowed. So that was a mechanism that they could censor almost anything if it didn't support a WHO kind of CDC kind of view. So that has changed a little bit, but that's no doubt the result of the Trump administration.
So tell me more about why the United States of America, the leading industrial nation in the world, is number 80 in healthcare. How did we get to be so low on the ratings, and how do those ratings get established in the first place?
Okay, so this is the a major organization that is involved, funded by Bill Gates, that has been behind the global burden of disease studies, and essentially what they're looking at is healthy life years, health adjusted life years. So it's healthy life expectancy. So you can look at longevity. Longevity is a useful marker for all of us who are interested in anti-aging. But what's really interesting is to look at how many years do we remain completely healthy, free
Right,
from morbidities or comorbidities.
right.
And in those terms, the IHME data puts America 80th, with the view that it will by 2050 move below 100th in the global rankings. So it not only puts it at the bottom of all industrialized high-income countries, it puts it at the bottom of many, or very low down on the list of medium income countries. Yet the US spends more money on healthcare, in
Mm-hmm.
excess of $12,000 per capita per annum, than any other country by a long range. So if you look at, say, countries like Peru, they do better than the US.
Mm,
So
crazy.
so what's causing it? Well, it is the usual culprits, but trying to get really firm data on how it all fits together and which is more important than the other is tough. But it is the food and the food quality, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not. It's also how Americans eat.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of people are thinking about the what you put into your mouth every day, but you've got to think of the how. So the how is going to be, how frequently do you eat? How much do you eat when you eat? What is the composition and the quality of the foods that you are consuming? When are you consuming sweet foods in
Mm-hmm.
relation to savory foods? And I'll just give you an example. If this practice of people in Western societies, but also many Eastern societies, of eating sweeter things after a main meal,
Mm-hmm.
what that does when you've got the protein, fats, and carbs in your diet, and then you have something sweet immediately afterwards, you buffer your insulin response. You blunt that insulin response. So, whereas if you get hungry in the middle of the morning, middle of the afternoon, you go, oh, my energy levels are going, and you put in biscuits or chocolate or candy or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
or you take, sweetened sodas,
Mm-hmm.
it's a nightmare for your blood sugar. And
Mm-hmm.
because insulin resistance, which underpins metabolic disease and type 2 diabetes and obesity, um, is to do with the frequency of insults of high blood sugar and raised insulin. If you then have three main meals a day and then you consume snacks in between, so that
Mhm.
you have maybe six, seven, eight eating episodes per
Mhm.
day, imagine you keep on insulting your cells and the cell membranes, making them more and more insulin resistant.
Mhm.
And we think about how we eat. Well, um, chewing 30 times every mouthful
Mhm.
to allow the digestive enzymes to synchronize. So
Mhm.
all the amylase is released in the salivary enzymes, and you've got sufficient stomach acid. Look at the fact that PPI drugs and antacids are amongst the most common pharmacy and pharmaceutical products used in the US. Use a PPI drug, you are cutting your acid in your stomach, which you need to chemically digest food.
Right.
Eat too quick, you don't release then the pancreatic enzymes, the bile enzymes, and everything else that are needed to digest your food properly.
Right.
If you eat your food while you are driving your car, while you're watching CNN news, looking at the latest things that are happening in Israel or anywhere else in the world,
Mhm.
you are not going to be in rest and digest mode
Mhm.
in your parasympathetic autonomic side of your nervous system, and you need to be in the parasympathetic mode. What happens is that people are in fight and flight mode on the
Sure.
sympathetic side of their, and you
Mhm.
can't digest food properly. So,
Mhm. And that's what people who eat on the run, like you say, or they're stressed out already
yeah,
and they're eating because they're stressed.
yeah.
So they're
So
only adding fuel to the fire because the stress is already fight or flight and the sympathetic
exactly,
nervous system is on overdrive. And now
totally.
you're adding into that the food that are probably more carbs, not complex carbs, but regular starchy carbs that, make it even more difficult to create the insulin response. Yeah,
Correct.
it's a vicious
So
cycle.
the mechanical breakdown, if we look at say carbs, yes, it's the amount of carbs, but you can look at kids' breakfast cereals that
Yeah,
have whole grain written on them,
right,
but that whole grain is so mechanically processed
right.
that if you look at the work of Jenny Brand Miller from Professor Jenny Brand Miller from Sydney University, if you go to glycemicindex.com, you can put in the search bar and look at how we respond to different foods, and you'll
Right.
find that those whole grain cereals behave exactly like sugar.
And they are sugar.
They
If
are.
you look at the ingredients, there's all of them, or almost all of them, have a very high sugar count. So
Exactly, but it's not. But even where the sugar count is lower, because of the degree of processing,
yes,
carbohydrate chains are mechanically broken down. They're processed. This is ultra processing. So ultra processed foods, UPFs are another big part of the problem. So
yeah.
they are. So and then coming back to the other thing I wanted to say is if you people know that the Mediterranean diet is healthy, but it's also how people in the Mediterranean eat. They take an hour off. They
Mm-hmm.
sit around a table. They
Mm-hmm.
put on some nice music. If it's in the evening, they may got a candle on,
Mm-hmm.
and they move themselves beautifully into parasympathetic mode. They exchange. They're not looking at the CNN on the television at the same time. So though that's a big part of it. But what about sitting? So people say, oh, you need to take more exercise. Well, sitting is the new smoking. Sitting
Mm-hmm.
is one of the most dangerous things that we do. We
Mm-hmm.
sit in the wrong way. And if you link that to posture,
Mm-hmm.
our musculoskeletal system is falling apart. Americans, the musculoskeletal system, if you look at the work being done, um, in the field of advanced biostructural correction, it's extraordinary how I mean, this is if you like, a branch of chiropractic that's been essentially sidelined because it is so effective and it basically runs against many of the norms that are pushed out there that you can't really do much about someone who's becoming kyphotic. We see the upper part of the spine collapsing because we're stuck in front of our
Right.
computers.
Well, I a lot of times have to catch myself because I'm looking down at my phone.
Yeah.
My phone's in my hand, and I'm looking at, reading emails, and I'm thinking, you know what? Your neck is going to get completely, what you look at, what you see when you see elderly people who have that problem with their spine. I
Yeah.
forgot the name of it, but they're all hunched
Yeah,
forward.
yeah. They got scoliosis,
Scoliosis, that's the word.
scoliosis, a twist in the spine,
Yeah,
which happens because their vertebrae have basically fallen off the stack. But
yeah,
then that turns into kyphosis, and they move forward in the upper part, the cervical part of
yeah,
their spine. So I'm talking to you now standing. I haven't
yeah.
sat down at my
Oh,
desk.
that's cool.
And it's easy to do, but we don't do it. Sitting is a really, really dangerous thing to do. But physical exercise, I mean, American people are way, way too sedentary.
Yeah,
Chronic stress is another factor.
yeah,
If you're fearful about your financial situation, your relationships, your job prospects,
yeah.
um, that is a killer. Chemicals in the environment, we know chemicals in the food, but in the air, in the water, PFAS chemicals, forever chemicals,
Mm-hmm.
perfluoroalkyl substances. These are organofluorine compounds, some of the most dangerous compounds around. Americans are being absolutely loaded by them through the food. We're pushing the FDA to release more data. The last time it released data was 2019. They're trying to argue that only meats and seafood are contaminated with the PFAS. We've done testing of even kale and even organic kale, and
Exactly.
it's all contaminated. And this stuff builds up in your body,
Well, but just recently they came out with protein powders
Yeah,
as having the PFAS in them, and everybody thinks, oh, I'm taking a protein powder, I must be doing the right thing for my body, for my collagen and my elastin, and then they look and see these articles about now they're full of forever chemicals.
yeah, exactly. So chemicals, I think another aspect that increasingly is coming out of the field of clinical psychology, as well as clinical psychoneuroimmunology, is our locus of control, our ability to feel in control of our lives. It
Mhm.
turns out that is a really important health determinant. And social isolation is one of the biggest
Well,
reasons people get so sick.
yeah,
And they often, people who are socially isolated, don't feel that they have control over their lives. They're waiting for the state, someone else, their
mhm.
doctor to control them. That is
Well,
super
well,
unhealthy.
well, that is the World Economic Forum. That is Klaus Schwab's vision. It's a totalitarian vision that we are going to be. You will own nothing, and you will be happy, and you will also be, um, in under our thumb, under our control. So,
Correct. And you'll
so
you'll sign a social contract that makes sure that you do it. It's kind of like a hive mentality. It turns human beings into, worker bees
yeah,
for the system, and we're all working for the queen bee in there.
exactly. Well,
Scary.
so before we're going to be cut off here in a little bit, I know the time would go by very fast, and just from Radfest and talking to you and Mel and Phil Mickens and our mutual friend, and oh, and even you were friends with Mark too, right? From Epic
Oh
Tea.
God,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I've just
yeah,
taken the products today. Yeah.
yeah.
We've known Mark Rosales for years. Yeah.
Yeah, I take Mark Rosales. I take his Epic Tea every day, but
So do I.
yeah,
Testosterone levels are doing well.
yeah, it's a good thing. Even for women, it's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but I knew that we would be able to talk forever because you have so much knowledge and so much experience. But before we go, I know you've written a book, and why don't you talk to us about that and your little offer, not little,
Yeah.
but your nice offer for our viewers.
Yeah, look, we wrote a book a couple of years ago called Reset Eating, and it's about resetting your metabolism. fundamentally. So using food as medicine. And we take people through a journey. It's got lots of pictures and images. It takes the science. It hopefully makes it pretty accessible to people, how you can, without any drugs, just by changing what you're eating and when you're eating and how you're eating, to reset your metabolism. One of the goals, people think about what do you do with food? Well, you eat healthy food. You try and reduce the calories. What we say, what your goal should be, is to achieve what we call metabolic flexibility. It's a scientific concept that basically means that you can use multiple fuels for energy. So it means you can use carbs. But of course, when we all did science as kids at school and uni, we learned about the Krebs cycle and mitochondria. And you remember it just had carbohydrates feeding through coenzymes Q10 pyruvate into the mitochondria and then running through electron transport to produce ATP. Well, the bottom line is we can also use protein. So, this is what's happening now with GLP receptor agonists, with weight loss
Right.
jabs.
Right.
You see the people with skinny arms.
Yeah.
Well, what's happening is they're consuming so little food that the body goes, holy cow, where are we going to get energy from? And
Right.
it's burning muscle. So
Right.
sarcopenia is now, accelerated sarcopenia, age-related muscle wasting is being
Right.
accelerated by these.
Right.
Very, very dangerous. But of course, we can also burn fats. But if you keep on consuming carbs, you literally put your fat burning apparatus, the beta oxidation of fatty acids, it goes through the liver, all of that just goes to sleep. And of
Yeah.
course, we all store, maybe half a kilogram of glycogen, which is, the storage form of glucose
Yeah.
in our liver and our skeletal muscles. So if you go along to the gym, the fitness suite, and you try and take 30 minutes of exercise every day, you can put a tick in the box, but all you'll be doing is burning that glycogen. So we also teach people how you can combine strength training together with more longer periods of activity. Human beings are designed to be active 10 hours a day. Sedentary behavior is a big part of the reason why we got it wrong. But this book is primarily about food, reset eating. We would love to give away a copy. Now, one of the reasons we can't give away many copies is basically we're sold out. We are in the middle of a reprint. We have a handful of copies sitting in our office in the States, in Virginia. We will happily, the first person is, am I right, that messages Michele, they will receive a signed copy of Reset Eating that is now out of print. You'll see it on Amazon, and you'll see it's temporarily off sale because we're waiting for the reprint to go through.
That is so generous of you, and I know it's a little bit of a
$47 is the list price on Amazon.
yeah. So no, but it's a real generous offer to our viewers, and I hope somebody who's watching right now gets on the phone or gets on the email. My email is the and then my name Michele Hughes and then company spelled out singular at Gmail. So whoever sends that email to me, and they'll get a signed copy, right? You'll be able to sign it,
Absolutely.
autograph it. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
And then once you get the new ones in print, I'd love to get a copy. I don't want to
Absolutely.
with a limited one now, but I want to definitely read that book. So, all right, well, Rob, thank you so much for coming on today. And I know it's a little bit later there for you, right?
No, it's approaching 8 p.m. in the evening, but
okay,
that's
time
early.
for dinner. Time for dinner.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted today, we'll have to have you back because I really wanted you to share with everybody what your perfect day looks like, because you're so knowledgeable about the nutritional part and then, of course, the exercise. And so at some point, maybe next, because we're booked through May of next year, but sometime next year, if you would come back, we will go into more.
I'm a 65-year-old guy. I just had my 65th birthday.
You're amazing.
I'm now healthier than I've been at any other stage of my life. So this idea that we have to get less healthy as we get older, what we do is we learn more about health. We
Yeah.
learn how to drive this incredibly sophisticated system that we
Yeah.
call human body and mind and spirit, and that's what it's all about.
And a big part of it is attitude, because, I just, like, every day I say thank you to God for allowing me to be 20 years younger biologically. And I think people need to understand that biological age is really the right measurement, not chronological. That chronological is just how many years you've gone around the sun. But if your body is 20 years older than your chronological age, you're in deep trouble. But
Yeah.
if your body is, 10, 20 years younger, like I'm sure yours is,
Yeah.
and you look younger, so you get it both ways, both the
Exactly.
internal
And
organs.
now we got fantastic tools like True Diagnostics,
I
to
was just going to tell you, I just
information.
finished my True Diagnostics
Yeah,
test. So
fantastic.
Ryan is a good friend of mine. I adore him, and
Okay.
Ryan Smith, and he's been on my podcast. So yeah, so I'll be getting those results. It'll be my third or second time doing their test. And then I did the telomere test with SpectraCell. So the
Okay.
telomere length is another measurement of your biological age. And then DNA, the DNA company out of Toronto does your epigenetic DNAs. That also gives you a measurement of. So there's so much technology today that tells you, guides you,
Absolutely.
and then all the other tools like photobiomodulation and no, red light therapy. I mean, and
Yeah.
other therapies. I just got Weber Medical. I don't know if you know them they're out of Germany.
Yes.
Robert Weber. Yeah, so he
Absolutely.
just sent
Okay.
me his watch, and
Okay.
that, you use that a couple, 3 times a day, and it's a laser technology. So they're a real medical device company, not a
Yeah.
consumer, although their watch is now addressing the consumer market. But yeah, there's so much available today to be able to not only measure, but to practice
Yeah.
and to feel the results with the help of these aids that are out there. And we didn't
Exactly.
even get into the brain, but the gut brain axis, and how much knowledge it helps to improve those two.
Get the vagal tone sorted, and of course this is what, if you look at Ayurveda or traditional Chinese medicine, they understood the relationship between the gut-brain connection and vagal
Absolutely.
tone, centuries ago. So we're catching up in the West.
Before we say goodbye, would you just give us your website so people can look at
Yeah,
your Alliance for
absolutely.
Health?
So I'll give you two websites. So we'll give our US one is very much focused on the political work that we do. We have calls to action all the time to Congress, to different government agencies. We are we're launching legal campaigns and initiatives all the time, lawsuits, etc. So that is ANH, which stands for Alliance for Natural Health, ANH-USA.org. So ANH-USA.org. If
Okay.
you want more information on the health side,
Yeah.
you can go to our international website, which is ANH, no dash, so ANHinternational.org.
So international spelled out.
Spelled out in full,
Okay.
ANHinternational.org.
Perfect.
And both of them have weekly newsletters that you can sign up to
Oh,
free
good.
of charge. So
Good.
there's a load of information coming through both of them. I would urge you to sign up to both.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, Rob. Well, have a good dinner.
Thank you so much,
All
Michelle.
right.
It's been such a pleasure to see you again.
We'll see you at. Are you going to be at A4M or at Radcliffe?
Do you know, our schedule is so tight at the moment.
Yeah.
Others know whether I will or I won't, but I
Okay.
don't. Yeah.
Well,
So
I'll
me
connect.
and my
I'll connect with
team.
Melanie.
Yeah.
I think
Mel
Phil.
will know.
I always go with Phil wherever Phil goes. I like to
Yeah.
go to because
Okay.
he leads the way. All
Good
right.
call.
Well, very good.
Good call.
Take care.
Take care. So
Okay.
good.
Cheers.
Bye, Michelle.
Bye.